Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to our reading of John Locke's second treatise. We are continuing today on chapter 16, which is second. I think it is. What is it? If I remember correctly, it's fifth largest. Um, yeah, it's the fifth largest with 22 paragraphs, sections in it. So that right back, and we'll go right into it. The title is on conquest. He's dealing with the question of conquest. Um, there's an important reason why he needs to do conquest is that he's dealt with conquest. He's dealt with some aspects of this. He hinted on it, but the English context is tied with the English history of the Norman conquest, right, and the reformulation and legitimacy of the the, the English crown in light of the conquest, right. And also, and that the fact that um, the crown that he's kind of legitimizing at the time of he's writing the second treatise is the crown by William and Mary, who, although descendant, I mean Mary is the daughter of James, it is won through an element of conquest. Okay, that James was defeated. James was scared off. James ran away because his military, he felt he was abandoned. And this was a conquest in one sense. That William of Orange, who was a descendant of James, a descendant of King James the first, the first, and his wife Mary, who was Mary Stuart, who was the daughter of King James the second. Um, you have the beginnings of the basis of what you can say is the current reign of England, right? And he's trying to, and he needs to justify a little bit of that conquest here, that this was done, even in the glory of the Glorious Revolution, which some people might argue was a form of conquest, right? Not really legitimate. That the real legitimate crown of England was the Stuart king, uh, uh, um, James II, and his new son Charles. Okay. But let's go into what section 175. Though government can originally have no other rise than that before mentioned, that is, through the consent of the government, people's formation of it, like they dealt with earlier, nor polities can be founded on anything but the consent of the people. Yet such has been the disorders ambition has filled the world with, that in the noise of war, which makes so great a part of the history of mankind, this consent is little taken notice of, and therefore many have mistaken the force of arms for the consent of the people, and reckon conquest as one of the origins of government, the original of government, origins of government. But conquest is far from settling up any government, as demolishing a house is from building a new one in the place. Indeed, it often makes way for a new frame of commonwealth by destroying the former, but without the consent of the people can never erect the new one. So his basically thrust is that there's been a confusion. In other words, his thrust here is that the only way, the only real way you form a government or you create a state is to the consent of the people. In other words, no polity, nothing, no polity can be formed on anything but the consent of the people. Even though that people have, and people in the past has mistaken conquest and the reality of conquest as the mistake of the people. Now he argues that conquest is nothing more but the destruction of the old existing regime or the existing state, and that in other words, he uses the metaphor of the house, or The old house is destroyed doesn't mean the house was built. It means that the old house is destroyed. Now it will make way for the new house, but it doesn't make the new house. Okay, and the same thing is he's trying to argue about conquest. Conquest may make way for the new state, but conquest does not create the state. It does not form a government in this sense. 176 that the aggressor who puts himself into the state of war with another and unjustly invades another man's right can, by such unjust war, never come to have a right over the conquered. Might be easily agreed, will be easily agreed by all men, who will not think that robbers and pirates have the same have a right of empire over whomever they have force to enough to master, or that men are bound by promises which unlawful force extorted from them. In other words, okay, he's saying that everyone's going to agree to the fact that he seems to suggest at one level that the fact that an aggressor waging war does not legitimately rule, does not have the right by doing this. He says, and the reason why everyone does this is because we don't want to legitimize the ability that that pirates and robbers have the legit, have what a right of empire over those that they can master, have the force enough to master. He says there in the language, and that this is, and that they should be bound because they were tied to the, and it can be bound by oaths made under fear of violence. Should a rob now gives the example? Should a robber break in my house and with a dagger at my throat make me seal deeds to convey my estate to him? Would this give him any title? Just such a title as his sword and his an unjust conqueror who forces me into submission. The injury and the crime is equal, whether committed by the wearer of a crown or some petty villain. So, in other words, I come in here, I attack you, I put a sword to you, and surrender. This is by no means gives legitimacy of. In other words, this does not mean consent. Now, Hobbes would argue, yes, you did, you consented. Hobbes would argue in Leviathan that, well, no, there was a consent. There was this situation that, you agree. In other words, the state of nature occurs in Hobbes. The argument goes is that a fear of escape, the fear of death, and the fear of violent death gets people to agree to the contract. Okay, to escape it. And yes, that there's this idea that it's not that I'm gonna, and it agrees with Locke in that there's no right to arbitrary rule, in the sense that they cannot take your life, because once the sovereign tries to take your life in Hobbes, the contract is broken and you have no more obligation to obey it anymore. Now, here, the argument here is there's no obligation here. Let's look at this further here, right? Wouldn't give me any title. In other words, he forced me to submit. The injury and the crime is equal, whether committed by the wearer of a crown or some petty villain. The title of the offender and the number of his followers make no difference for the offense, unless it to aggravate it. Aggravate. In other words, the argument is it doesn't make a difference what the title is. The title does not legitimize. If someone robs you and takes something and forces you, and forces by a knife point to you to surrender a right, this does not mean that right has been surrendered lawfully. The argument goes, and that doesn't make a difference if it's done by a king or anyone else. In that sense, the title does not make it. It only aggravates it. Right? He says makes it worse in that sense. The only difference is great robbers punish little ones to keep them in their obedience, but the great ones are rewarded with laurels and triumphs because they are too big for the weak hands of justice in this world and have the power in their own possession, which would punish offenders. So this is a very his argument here is the great robbers. This is almost a cynical argument that I don't mean this is a very. No, he says that the greatest, great robbers punish, discipline weaker robbers. Right, that's the first thing. They punish to keep them in their discipline. Right. The great ones, however, are rewarded with laurel. The great robbers are rewarded with laurels and triumph because they're too big for weak. Justice. In other words, the argument here is that justice has weak hands. This is interesting, and because of the weak hands, the great robbers are able to get what they're able to get off without punishment. In other words, they have the power of their own possessions, which should punish their offenders. In other words, justice should punish the offenders, but justice seems to be on its own natural justice, right? The justice that's inherent in the nature, in the state of nature. And remember that that civil right is not a new alternative justice. It is the enactment of it is the civil order enacting the justice of nature, right? That's the kind of argument Locke seems to have argued before. Hobbes would argue that no, it's justice only exists in through consent. It only just when we create it, human create it in that sense. There is no natural justice. That's the big disagreement between Locke and Hobbes, right? That Locke seems to suggest that there is this natural justice. It's impotent. It's not able to address this problem even. Okay, the great criminals, the great robbers. Okay, um, so what is his remedy? What is my remedy against a robber who that so broke into my house? Appeal to the law for justice, but perhaps justice is denied, or I am crippled and cannot. I am crippled and cannot stir, robbed and have not the means to do it. If God has taken away all means of seeking a remedy, there is nothing left but patience. Okay, so I have to be patient. He's saying, if there's no means of remedy, what do I do? It's like, so I can't even fight. Patience. But my son, when able, may seek the relief of law, which which I am denied. He or his son may renew his appeal till he recovers his right. But the conquered, or the children, or their children, have no court, no arbiter on earth to appeal to. Then they may appeal as Jebediah did to heaven, and repeat their appeal till they have recovered their native right of their ancestors, which was to have such a legislature over them as the majority should approve and freely acquaint them. So therefore he says what? If there's no one to judge or appeal to, you don't have the means to directly appeal to heaven. You can wait. Your children can come in here. In other words, but there's no. Even when they have no appeal to make, right? There's no law and authority to appeal to, because he controls all the usurper controls not usurper the person who is exercising conquest has this. And you can same right of Jepidita, which is the right of revolution, right? The right to appeal to heaven. This idea of appealing to heaven is appealing to waging war. It's another way of his. This seems to be the way of waging war. There's two types of waging war. There's waging unjust war, and there's waging, an appeal to heaven. Appeal to heaven is done because your rights have been violated. You've been harmed. Your life, liberty, and property are being threatened, and that there's no judge to appeal to. Okay, That's that this is an appeal, and that you're trying to restore your life, liberty, and property. Okay, this is what an appeal to heaven means. Whereas the person who just simply, I want your take. In other words, there's a distinction between an appeal to heaven and an aggressor. In other words, a conquest. Conquest is that I have a desire to have your thing. I'm going to take it. I'm going to use force to take it, and I'm going to conquer it. Okay, this is I want what you have, and I'm going to take it. This is conquest in that sense. His argument here is that there's no right to conquest, and conquest is not, and the mere act of conquest does not create or legitimize rule. In fact, it is the state of war. Remember, slaves are in the state of war in that sense, until they no longer are in the state of war. That's that weird thing that he raises. Um, so let's continue. Now that they says that to recover their native right as their ancestor, which they have legislature for them, majority should approve of and freely request. Right? If it not be objected, this would cause endless. If it if it be not objected, this would cause endless trouble. In other words, he says that someone might object that this might cause any trouble. I answer, no more than justice does, where she lies open to all that appeal to her. So his argument is that someone may object to the argument that is, well, you can have a right to revolution, you can have the right to appeal to heaven. Oh, that would cause injustice. That would be what the argument would. That would be causing endless trouble. The right this endless trouble, and this is kind of we can argue that this is kind of a critique as Locke. I mean Hobbes in Leviathan, particularly in chapter 16, I think it was 16, 17, or is it? I can look it right here. Yeah, 18, chapter 8, chapter 18, where he goes into the rights of the sovereign, and there's no right to criticize it, right to challenge him in that sense. Locke seems to critique. This is where Locke. There is this argument that I'm sorry. In this case, yes, you do. He's not your legitimate sovereign. This is a foreign power invading you, the conqueror. He's not really the legitimate ruler, and that he has no more objection to this than, and that you have the right to repeal. Now, the argument is when the ruler, there's the argument of what the what the Stuarts were they legitimate rulers of England, or were they Scottish interlopers? Were they really legitimate rulers, or were they not really? In other words, they when the people agreed to their rule, that was okay. But when they didn't agree to their rule, and when they lost power, and that women marry become crowned not because of the conquest, but because the people consented to it. The argument goes right. That's the kind of logic that Locke wants to make the argument to. And the argument here is that such a right of the people to throw off conquerors or to appeal to heaven would cause nothing. And his argument is that if we argue that, then he says, I would answer no more than justice does. In other words, if you believe that people have a right to justice, justice that in itself causes trouble and instigate no ends of trouble, right? Where she lies open to all that appeal to her. He that troubles his neighbor without a cause is punished for it by the justice of the court he appeals to. And he that appeals to heaven must be sure he has. In other words, if you appeal to heaven, you must be sure that you have right on your side. He has right on his side, and a right too that is worth the trouble and the cost of the appeal. So therefore, it has to be, again, this is appeal to heaven. You better make sure you have the right reason. It's done for the right reason. legitimate reason in that sense, and that what to be sure that you have right on your side. An appeal that must be has right on its side, right? So it must be done for the just reason, and right too that is worth the trouble, or something that the thing being done must be worth the trouble it causes. That is war, right? And the cost of the appeal. And he will answer to at a tribunal that cannot be deceived. In other words, God, right? And will be sure to retribute to everyone according to the mischief he has created to his fellow subjects. That is, any part of mankind, from whence it is plain that he that conquers in an unjust war can whereby have little title to the subjugation and obedience of the conqueror. So, in other words, anyone who conquers an unjust war, the argument is, then what's a just war and unjust war? In other words, a just war is that there's legitimate reason to do it. You've attacked me, you've harmed me, you've done something against me. You're the aggressor, and I defeat you. Okay. In other words, who's the aggressor? Who's the aggressor? Who is the one violating the laws of nature here? Okay. What is the and the laws of nature is kind of understood as the justice in this sense. So international law, and therefore this is what this is early modern things. The idea that the laws of nature were the laws of justice. The the ux naturalibus, in other words, the law of nature, the law us gentium, the law of nations, and us natura, the law of nature, were the same in that sense. They were identical in the sense. This is the old Roman law, the natural law. The laws of nations and the law of nature were one in this sense, and that therefore, in this sense, Locke echoes this kind of Grotian Pufendorfian understanding here of this interconnection between of natural law and the laws of nations, right? And therefore, the argument here is that okay, then if you're going to have this conflict, it has to be worth the trouble, right? It has to be the right reasons. The trouble must be significant to do it, and the cost of it must be reasonable. Otherwise, you have to prepay. If you, it doesn't, there's going to be you have to. And again, the metaphor. He's the problem here is that if there's no God, if there's no, in other words, Locke seems to be resting on this perception and their people's belief that there's a God, and that God will punish the wicked. Okay. Okay. But the problem is, what happens if there is no ultimate God in the sense? There's no God and there is no judge. There's no real judge that will, at the end of the day, but even this nature is going to be the judge, right? Nature is going to think, things held by force or coercion won't last. The argument goes, even if the God, even in this classic sense, eventually the unjust ruler will age, get weak, and what was and will be treated the same way he treated others, right? There's this idea of karma, right? This in a kind of, even if there is no God in that greater sense, nature is also kind of this balance. The argument goes here, but okay, let's look at this. But even if we don't do this question, he ends it on the question of that. In other words, it's also plain, right, that he that conquers in an unjust war can have no title to subjection or obedience of what he's conquered, right? So let's look at number 77. But supposing victory favors the right side. So let's assume that victory favors the right side. Let us consider a conqueror in a lawful war and see what power he gets and from whom. So, so look at this. Now, this is, I think, is going to be the Norman conquest. Yes. First, it is plain that he gets no power by his conquest over those that conquered with him. They that fought on his side cannot suffer by the conquest. but must at least be as much freemen as they were before. So whoever was on this, they must be. In other words, those who fought on this side must be free before. And most commonly, they serve upon terms and upon condition to share with their leader and enjoy a part of the spoil and other advantages that attending the conquering sword, or at least have a part of the subdued country upon bestowed upon them. And the conquering people are not, I hope, to be slaves by conquest, and wear their laurel only to shew they are sacrificing to their leader's triumph. They that found absolute monarchy upon the title of the sword make their heroes, who are the founders of such monarchies, uh, um, aren't draw cancers. Draw cancers. Um, I have to check what that means. I think that draw cancer. Yeah, draw cancer. This is a no. It's and the on the Cox edition, he gives a note. It's draw cancer. He says draw cancers. The Oxford English traces this name to a blustering character of second Duke of Buckinghamshire satirical play, the rehearsal. In the last scene, draw cancer kills all the combatants on both sides. Another character says of him that he does what he wills, without regard to manners, justice, or number. Okay, so if it's again, this is a the second Duke of Buckingham, which is therefore he's appealing to a well-known play. Locke is doing here, a well-known play at the time. The rehearsal 1761. So remember, this is 1787, 88, 89, 1786, 87, 89. So it's a decade away. A decade happened. Like a movie, like a movie 10 years ago. It's like it makes reference to art as something that was relatively well read. So he's a guy who kills everyone at the last stage, both sides, not because he you know and forget they had any officers and soldiers that fought on their side in the battle and they won, or assisted them in the subduing, or shared in the possessing the countries they now master. We are told by some that the English monarchy is founded in the Norman conquest, and that our princes have thereby a title of total absolute dominion, which, if it were true, as by the history it appears otherwise, that and that William had a right to make war on the island, yet his dominion by conquest could reach no farther than to the Saxons and Britons, than were then inhabitants of this country. The Normans that came with him and helped him to conquer, and all descendants from them, and the freemen, and no subjects by conquest. Let that give what dominion it will. Okay, so his argument is, oh, only the Anglo-Saxons. Whereas he says, those who came with him, uh, right? It only goes further the Saxons and the Britons, right? Than that then were then the inhabitants of the country. The Normans came with him and came to help conquer, and all that descended from them are free men. So whoever they descended, their children and their children and their children, and no, and not and are no subjects by conquest. Let that give dominion where it will. And if I or anyone else shall claim freedom or derived from them, it will be very hard to prove to the contrary. And it is plain, the law that has made no distinction between one and the other intends not there should be any difference in their freedom or their privileges. In other words, those who came after them, So therefore, this is like almost saying, "Oh, who cares? That may be true at that time, but over here now, this doesn't matter because these are these are the descendants uh, 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 of the Normans and the families that they created and the thing and those who they gave membership into the thing to, right? That's that he makes that kind of position argument. Section 178. But supposing, which seldom happens, that the conquerors and the conquered never incorporated into one people under the same laws and freedom. Let us see next what a power a lawful conqueror has over the subdued. That and that I say is purely despotical. He has absolute power over the life of those who by unjust war have forfeited them, but not over the lives or fortunes of those who engage not in the war, nor over the possessions even of those who are actually engaged in it. That's even more radical. In other words, even if I conquer you, I control you. I control the lives of that, but not those who weren't involved in the so the non-combatants and those like that. I can't take their lives, and I can't take their property. Neither can I take the property of those who are involved and killed them. In other words, the soldiers and warriors, but not the overall. So it seems to very argue that even if you conquer them, you can't really conquer them, right? That's and 179. Secondly, I say, then the conqueror gets no power, but only over those who actually assisted, concurred, or consented to the unjust force that was used against him. For the people having given to their governors no power to do an unjust thing, such as to make an unjust war, for they never had such a power in themselves, they ought not to be charged as guilty of the violences and injustice that is committed in an unjust war any further than they actually abetted it, nor more than they are to be thought guilty of any violence or oppression that governors should use upon people themselves or any part of their fellow subjects. They have empowered them no more to the one than to the other. So therefore, he makes the interesting argument that people, when they empower their governor, only empowers them to do right. They don't empower them to do bad. Therefore, when the actor violates the rules, you can't blame the subject. Now, this is a wonderful. This is sophistry. This is Locke's kind of like, let's have a consistent logical thing. Let's have a simple logical thing. But the reality is, to what degree then people are responsible for their government? And of course, they intend it to be good, but they don't do anything to stop them when they're bad, when they're not doing things. In other words, in other words, when do you become an accomplice? And the argument is that if you can be, if you are abetted, if you aided and abetted the actor who did the unjust thing, then you are responsible. Okay, but if you had no role, if you did not, in other words, you didn't actively abet or aid. In other words, the argument is that you can't be held responsible when the government that you've originally created and the actors in that government now do bad, unless you actively assisted them, abetted it or aid. But then the question becomes what constitutes such assistance and aid? Is it consent when you consent to what they did, or fail to resist what they did? But what happens if you fail to resist because you don't think you can win? Okay, you understand that's the problem in that sense. That you don't feel that you can win. Remember that maybe the government is unjust in that sense. You can't be held against it, but then you don't opt to consent to it. What happens if you give support to it or decide to fight for it? Okay, even if it's unjust. Therefore, this is the weird thing about this, right? Um, what is it? Conquerors, if true, seldom trouble themselves to make the distinction, but they willingly permit the confusion of war to sweep all together. But this, but but yet this alters not the right, for the conqueror's power over the lives of the conquered, uh, uh, um, being only because they have used force to do so, or maintain an injustice. He can have the power only over those who have concurred in that force. All the rest are innocent, and he has no more title over the people of that country, who have done him no injury, and so have made no forfeiture of their lives, than he has over any other, who without any injury or provocation have lived upon fair terms with him. Okay, so therefore the argument is that you want it's a limited this idea of okay I've conquered you because you waged war on me, but this is not you waged war on me. It doesn't mean that the innocent those who didn't agree to this, those who didn't participate, aren't assisting you with this, those who just may have disagreed but didn't fight you, those who are not non-combatants, the children and those who didn't engage in it, those who did not actively assist that or authorize, they can't be held accountable for this, and the conqueror has no authority over them in that sense. Has no authority over them, cannot take their lives or their property. Right now, this is has um, and he has no terms over anyone else. Right, the idea is that they have no for their lives, and he has than any other who, without any injuries or provocation, had lived upon fair terms with him. So therefore, since technically, in other words, these people, those who want the non-combatants, those who did not engage or benefit from this, not encourage or help in the unjust action of the order that you just defeated. These you don't have the dominion over. Okay, you don't have the power a power over them in that sense. You cannot touch them, or if you touch them, then you're just actively engaging in an unjust act as the guy who attacked you. Okay, in other words, the argument here is that you have no authority over them as you'd have no authority over someone who did not harm you. Okay, and that have lived in fair terms. If someone had acted up who lived upon fair terms with you. Okay, that's how he ends it here, saying that you have your authority over uh, uh, um, uh, the authority to act and control over the innocent here of this conquering power. You use conquered the conquered power. The innocent, those who didn't have a role, they didn't support or help in the injustice that you fought against. Um, um, they're on the same term as people who had did nothing wrong against you. So, thirdly, this is number 180, right? Thirdly, a power that conquers gets over those he overcomes in an unjust war is perfectly despotical. He has the absolute power over the lives of those who, by putting themselves in a state of war, have forfeited them. But he has not, whereby the right to their titles or their possession, so their land, right, their land, their possession, their titles, their possessions. But I doubt not, but at first sight will seem a strange doctrine, it being so quite contrary to the practices of the world, there being nothing more familiar in speaking about the dominion domination of countries than to say such a one conquered it, as if conquest without any more ado conveyed a right to possession, right? But when we consider that the practice of a strong and the powerful, how universal soever it may be, is seldom the rule of right, however it be one part of the subjugation of the conquered, not to argue against the conditions cut out to them by the conquering sword. In other words, this argument here is that okay, there's a difference between force and right. Okay, that the reality of conquest, this period of conquest, we assume that this is, yeah. In other words, let's say that this happened to be that means that they possess it. But his argument is that, well, they might seem to possess it, but they don't really in right possession. There's still the war there. There's a war that is still going on here. Now it might be the force might be holding it together, holding on to it, but eventually those who are resisting, or the occasion might occur that those who do not support or consent to this position will appeal to heaven, use force. Okay. 181 through in through in all war there be usually a completion of force and damage, and the aggressor seldom fails to harm the estate when he uses force against the persons of those he makes war upon. Yet it is the use of force only that puts man in a state of war. When for whatever by force he brings the injury, or else quietly, uh, and by fraud done the injury, he refuses to make reparations, and by force maintains it, which is the same thing as the first, to have done it by force. It is the unjust use of force that makes the war. So the unjust use of force makes the war. In other words, force, I do something by fraud, but then to keep it, I then have to use force to maintain it. Again, this is so force or fraud. Fraud is kind of a form of force, or require force. So therefore, the unjust use of force to achieve something, that take something you want, or you get it. This is the injury. This is a breach of justice. Okay. Um, Now it makes the war. Okay, colon, sorry. For he that breaks open my house and violently turns me out the door, or having peacefully gotten in by force keeps me out, doesn't affect the same thing. In other words, he makes the example. In other words, I come in by force and kick you out, or I come in by fraud and then kick you out. These are the same thing, essentially the same thing, in effect the same thing. Supposing we are in such a state that we have no common judge on earth, whom I may appeal to, and to whom we are both obliged to submit, for such a thing I am for such I am now speaking. For of such I am now speaking. It is the unjust use of force. If it is the unjust use of force, then, that puts a man in the state of war with one another. So go all the way back to the state of war chapter. I think that chapter is tempered. What is that? That's all the way 4. Chapter 4, I think. Let's go back. Yeah, the state of war in chapter 3. Sorry, I'm correct. State of 3, chapter 3, all the way back in chapter 3. In other words, this use of force, this use of violence, this action, this is the state of war in that sense. And it is the use only the it is the use of force that only puts a man in the state of war. For whatever by force he begins the injury, or else having quietly and by fraud done the injury, he refuses to make the reparation and by force maintains him, which is the same thing. And to have done by it force, it is the unjust use of force that makes the war. For he that breaks open, now this is that example that right, this again piece of end, the same thing. I'm repeating myself. And does the same thing, supposing that we are in a state of war, in such a state that we have no common judge on earth to whom to appeal, and to whom we are both obliged to submit. For and this is now what he's speaking of. For it is the unjust use of force then that puts a man in the state of war with one another, and whereby that is whereby he that is guilty of it makes a forfeiture of his life. Therefore, who uses force unjustly, for quitting reason, which is the rule given between man and man, and using force the way of beast, he becomes likable to be destroyed by him he uses force against, as any savage ravenous beast that is dangerous to his being. So therefore, in other words, once you use force, you're treated like a beast, and the force we apply to you, you'll be destroyed by the force. So that's what he's saying. One section 182. But because the miscarriages of his father are no fault of the children, that may be rational and peaceable, notwithstanding the brutishness and injustice of the father. The father, by his miscarriages and violence, can forfeit his own life, but involve not his children in his guilt or destruction. His goods, which nature hath willeth the preservation of all mankind as much as it is possible, hath made to belong to the children, to keep them from perishing, to still continue to belong to his children. For supposing them not to have joined in the war through their either through infancy, absence, or choice, they have done nothing to forfeit them. Nor has the conquest any right to take them away by the bare title of having subdued him that by force attempted his destruction. Though perhaps he may have some right to them to repair the damages he sustained by the war in defense of his own right, which, how far it reaches to the possessions of the conquerors, we shall see by and by. In other words, okay. In other words, you have a right to, you wage war. You don't have the right to everything he owns, but you have a right to compensation. Take some of what he's owned in order to compensate you, repay you the damages the costs of the war, and the damages that he's done to you. Okay, so but he's having. Let's talk about this by and by. He's not going to go into any further detail, right? So that he uh, uh, that by conquest has a right over a man's person to destroy him as he pleases, has not thereby a right over his estate to possess and enjoy it. For it is the brutal force of the aggressor has it is the brutal force of the aggressor has used that gives his adversary a right to take away his life and destroy him if he pleases, as a noxious creature. But it is a damage sustained that alone gives him title to another man's goods. So only damages. In other words, for his life, his mere violation of the law and his attack, I can take his life. Regarding his property, I can only deal it as damages. Okay, the damages. Um, um, noxious creature, another man good. It might, in other words, okay, possession. Okay, let me see. No right to his estate and possession. This brute force of the aggressor was used for he that okay. Now this so he that conquereth has right over man person destroy him as he pleases has not a right to over his estate to possess or enjoy it. For it is the brutal force of the aggressor has used that gives the adversary the right to take away his life and destroy it if he pleases as a noxious creature, but it is the damage sustained that alone gives him title to another man's goods. Semicolon, sorry. For though I may kill a thief that set upon me in the highway, I may not, which seems less, take away his money or let him go. This would be robbery on my side. His force and the state of war he put himself in made him forfeit his life, but gave me no title to his goods. Then the right then of conquest succeeds only to the lives of those whom joined in war, not to their estates, but only in order to make reparations for the damages received and the charges of the war. And that too, with reservation of the right of the innocent wife and children. So therefore, you can't take everything. You can take some damages. It's an equation in that sense, right? Okay. 183. Let the conqueror have as much justice on his side as can be supposed. He has no right to seize more than the vanquished could forfeit. His life is at the victor's mercy, and his service and goods he may appropriate to make himself reparation, but he cannot take the goods of his wife and children. They too have a title to the goods he enjoyed and the share in the estate he possessed. For example, I in the state of nature and all in commonwealth are in the state of nature one with another, have injured another man and have refusing to give satisfaction, it comes to a state of war, wherein my defending by force what I have gotten unjustly makes me the aggressor. I am conquered. My life, it is true, as forfeit, is at mercy, but not my wife's and children's. They made not war, nor assisted in it. I could not forfeit their lives. They were not mine to forfeit. My wife had a share in my estate, and that neither could I forfeit. And my children also, being born to me, had a right to be maintained out of my estate, labor and in its substance. Here, then, okay, stop. I rob you. I take your property. By the time I made it mine. My children now live off it. My children get money from it. It's been sold, and now it's my money, my children. Okay, yeah. I robbed you, and I taken your things. I conquered, and I looted your house. And this is an example of Germans, right? The Germans took all the things of the Jews, took the things, and they didn't just keep the Jews. Some of them did. Some of the things, rich ones, very rich ones, did. But most of the rank and file Nazis didn't, keep the wonderful things. What happened was they were sold, transferred in cash, and their lives, they bought radios and good things. Okay, that's how German. This is how Hitler was able to keep the middle class happy. Okay. So you come. He wants it back. They defeat the Germans, and now the Germans have to pay. Oh, but no, because you can't take it from the kids. Wait a minute, but how is retribution going to be done in the reality? Okay, this is the problem with this Lockean system is too. It assumes that individuals have no collective responsibility. It's all individualism here. It says, "Oh my God, this abstract notion." Well, okay. The things of the parents, is there an obligation of the children to take the sins of the father? The Christian argument is the sins of the father do not. But we do. We have, we at the same time think of original sin. We think of the fact that we inherit the character of our parents. And if, therefore, if our parents were, you know, what happens about this idea of this, that we don't want to say, in fact, this is, and I think would argue is that there is this, he's relying on the scripture positions to kind of give, out of here. There is a problem here that this is, he doesn't want to, he wants to limit this. And he has a nice logical setup here. But the problem with this is that, but the social this ignores the social connections and social responsibility of actors upon with each other. My wife had no share, but she shared your bed. She gave you comfort. Uh, she aided you. Did she stop having relationship with you because you were unjust? You're not, they may not be fighting with you, but they're helping you fight by supporting you, loving you, giving you warmth and comfort. If they now maybe, should they have to repudiate you? Wife, no longer sleep with your husband, separate from him, run away. This is the feminist argument. Run away, go off. Okay, active rebellion. That's evidence. The failure to do that, is that tacit consent with the harm being done. In other words, that's the problem in Locke, is that, wait a minute, do we have this? To what degree does abetting, aiding and abetting matter? Does giving emotional support and loyalty and help and not resisting evidence of abetting of this? And therefore, you're not as innocent. The wife and children aren't as innocent because they have had some assistant. They play a role in the injustice. Okay, this is the problem with this argument. See, he assumes that there is this division between the children and the thing and the obligation of the non-combatants. Now, they are non-combatants, but to what degree are non-combatants compliant in a society to the degrees of the injustice? Now, his argument is that the average people don't have any real responsibility of this. Well, okay, whatever. Now, he continues. Okay. Um, yeah. The wife's share and of her own husband's late. In other words, then in this case, the conqueror has a title to reparation of the damages received, and the children have a title to their father's estate and their substance, and the wife's share. And in the words that she has a share there, right? Um, and plain title to it. Her husband could not forfeit what is hers. What must be done in this case? I answer, the fundamental law of nature being that all, as much as may be, should be preserved. It follows that there will be not enough fully to satisfy both, viz., for the conqueror's losses and the children's maintenance, that he that hath and to spare must remit something of his full satisfaction and give way to the pressing and preference title of those who are in danger to perish without it. So therefore, the children and the wife and the children perish without. I can't satisfy my thanks. In other words, this is almost like saying, okay, you can kill them, but you can't take their property. Then why would you go? Whoa. Ah! You give a right to restitution, but now you say, oh, but then you have to worry that if you take too much, they won't be able to survive, and therefore you're you know, This is Locke trying to have it, a lot. This is frustrating. 184. But supposing the charge and damages of the war are to be made up to the conqueror, to the utmost farthing, and that the children in the vanquished, spoiled of all their father's good, are to be left to starve and perish. Yet the yet the satisfying of what shall, on this score, be due to the conqueror, will scare give him any title to the country he conquered. So let's say all the damages but I don't have the right to that country, the land. He's saying, right? I can make them leave them nothing. They have nothing, right? Um, uh, um, um, uh, uh, um, have title to the land. For the damages of war can scarce amount to the value of any considerable tract of land. But that's not true. In other words, he seems to argue, oh, but the cost of the war won't lead to, okay, what happens, this is, in other words, maybe not, we'll see. In other words, for the damages of the war can scarcely amount to the value of any, this is a very very false statement. This is, maybe time of his early 16th century war, but today modern war, no, this is the damages can be high, amount to considerable tracts of land in any part of the world where all the land is possessed, and none lies waste. And if I had not taken away the conqueror's land, and if I had not taken away the conqueror's land, which being vanquished, it is impossible I should scarce any other spoil I have done him can amount to the value of mine. In other words, the vanquished. In other words, if I had not taken away the conqueror's land, which being vanquished, it is impossible that I should scarce any other spoil I have done him can amount to the value of mine. So, supposing it is equally cultivated, and to an extent any way coming near what I had overrun of his, the destruction of a year's product or two, for it seldom reaches 4 or 5, is the utmost spoil that usually can be done. As for money, such as riches and the treasures taken away, these are none of nature's goods, and they have but a fantastical imaginary value. Nature has put no such upon them, but has put no such upon them. They are of no more account by her standard than the wampanoag of the American, or the European to a European prince, or the silver money of Europe would have been formerly to the American Indians, right? The wampanoag is the Indian money, right? Um, in other words, this idea is that these things are subjective. These things of arbitrary value, fictionary money, and things like that, capital. But wait a minute. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Go back there, horsey. Your whole damn argument about the nature of wealth production and things back all the way back there about the productivity of something, man's work and effort. So nature gives no value to the work and effort. Contradiction, Mr. Locke. If you're going to have your argument about capitalism laid early as you did, that this effort and work, okay, then the effort and work of that all these things that they built now have been destroyed in the war. That all this effort and work is lost and done. So if that is nothing, if that is all these things that we created, all this, remember, all this is transferred, all that work and effort is transferred into symbols of money, and we use these symbols of money so that we can make work and transfer all that effort like that. Okay, but if that is destroyed and lost, it's nothing because of nature. Okay, then if this is true, then your whole argument about production is false. Either or, maybe. If that is true, then whoa, the cost of war can be very high, and it has to be compensated. And it is, in other words, there is obligations in here. This is okay. This is the problem of this. This is he's not consistent. Very inconsistent. Locke is here. In other words, I've been determined in 5 years worth of product is not worth the perpetual inheritance of land. Huh? Not true. I mean, it's not 5 years. Okay, the people you killed, their labor has been lost, and all their effort. In other words, let's say you attacked me, and all those workers that had died, their future earnings, their future labor, all that things that would have benefited me and my people for the long term has been destroyed. Okay, opportunity costs. In other words, you argued about the nature of opportunity costs and economic development there. Well, that same principle applied to this makes the cost of war, gives me huge costs of war. That therefore, okay, maybe these people, and also the question of compliance. That did the wife and children resist? Therefore, they didn't resist. Therefore, they abetted, and therefore can be used to compensate. Their labor can be used to compensate. The argument could be made. In other words, this is Locke wants to have it nice, but in order to have it nice, he has to ignore the logic of his own system. Uh, okay, not worth the perpetual inheritance of the land, for which is possessed, and none remain waste, to be taken up by him that is deceased, which will be easily granted if one has to take away the imaginary value of money. So money is imaginary value. Okay, it's imaginary value of money. The proper. In other words, again, imagine, but value. But this is what a symbol of representation. It's maybe an imaginary value, but it's not imaginary value. It is the it is the thing representing all the value that you through your labor and your efforts. Again, contradicting his own argument. Okay, imagine value of money and the disposition being more than between 5 and 500, though at the same time half a year's product is more worth than the inheritance, whereby being more land than the inhabitants possess and make use of. Anyone has liberty to make use of the waste, but their conquerors take little care to possess themselves of the land of the vanquished. Take little care to possess themselves of the land of the vanquished. No damage, therefore, that men in the state of nature, all the princes and governments are in reference to one another, suffer from one another, can give a conqueror power to dispose the posterity of the vanquished and turn them out of their inheritance, which ought to be the possessions of them and by their descendants to all generations. Okay, this creates real problems. Why? Okay, uh, Mr. Locke, colonial rule over Indians. This totally delegitimizes any kind of colonial rule. Somebody everywhere possesses the land. Did they possess the land? Did they really understand that this land is theirs? Remember, this is the problem that in you know not every agrarian populations have the concept of land. His argument assumes that everyone has the same stage of development, but they're not going to be in the stage of development. Hunter gatherers will not understand property rights, and they don't have concepts of property in the normal sense. Therefore, whoa, what's going on here? Um, so you have an inconsistency or a problem in Locke, because he seems to suggest that, oh, no, land and this stuff, you have no right to take away their land and possessions. You have no right to conquer them and deprive them of their ability to live in the future. Okay, and anyone has liberty to make use of the waste. Anyone has liberty to make use of the waste, but the conquerors take little care to possess themselves of the lands of the vanquished. No damage, therefore, that men in the state of nature. In other words, the state of nature argument, right? In other words, the argument is that only the state, in states, and what happens is all princes and governments are in reference to one another in the state of nature, suffer from one another, can give the conqueror power to dispose the posterity of the vanquished and turn them out of their inheritance, which ought to be the possession of them and their descendants for all generations. The conqueror will indeed will be apt to think himself master, and it is the very condition of the subdued not to be able to dispute their right. But if that be all, it gives no other title than what barefaced force gives to the stronger over the weaker. And by this reason, he that is stronger hath a right to whatever he pleases to seize on. So his argument is that conquest means basically I have a right to conquer. This leads us to the war. In other words, you either have to accept my logic, or or robbers have a right to what they take. In other words, he set up a nice. This is all a rhetorical, sophistical argument. To honestly say, you either have to agree. It starts from the logic of this thing. We all do agree that the robber doesn't get a right to take it. Of course, we agree to that. Well, if you do that, then you're condemned to take this position because you can't. In other words, he makes this sophistical argument. But you know, there's something unreasonable about his position here. Something problematic. And maybe war is problematic in that sense. Maybe war has a problem about justice. Um, uh, Maybe justice can never be perfectly embodied. Everything is, in other words, the realm of justice might be at best imperfect. Okay, so therefore we try to make the best we can do. But sometimes, wait a minute. But then again, what about the people who don't are innocents, who didn't wage the war, but they supported the regime? And what's not? And by the way, what do you think may happen if you don't punish them? Well, you killed their pop, but then you killed their pop, but they want revenge. They're gonna, and you send them back and leave them with their wealth and their positions. They'll take their revenge in a decade or two. They'll come back and they'll want it back and vengeance. So, what the frig you doing? You just waited to war, but the same people are going to say, "But they killed my pappy," and they're going to want revenge against them. But they say, "But take war. If you don't make them pay, that they can't grow again." But then again, that's bad too because that's unjust. Well, maybe there needs to be injustice in that sense. Maybe there's some injustice that needs to be done to ensure that no future injustice is done. Right? That problem. Maybe this case in war, that to prevent the future injustice, we commit a little injustice. But whose injustice is worse? Your injustice at the beginning of waging the war, or the injustice of then taking the wealth and property of the children? Locke seems to argue that later thing is worse than the first thing. because if you accept the right to do that the stronger can take then you've agreed to in other words, it's the rule of the stronger over the weaker, and he can and the strongest can have a right to whatever he sees. 185 over those that have joined with him in the war, and over those of the subdued country that opposed him not, and the posterity even of those that did the conqueror, even in just war, has by conquest no right of dominion. What? Those who have joined, that have joined him in that war. So and over those of the subdued country that opposed him not, didn't fight with him, and the posterity of those that did. So therefore, those who came with him, those who fought with him, those of the subdued country that did not oppose him, did not fight against him, and the posterity, even those who did fight against him, you can't punish. The conqueror, even in a just war, hath by his conquest no right of dominion. They are free from any subjugation to him of their former government be dissolved. They are at liberty to begin and erect to themselves. This idea, now this is another thing, his idea that governments have no connection to the society, that all of a sudden the government ends and it's okay, pick a scratch. What happens if this is something that he does see? He understands the Lockean understanding is this individual. I'm an individual, every individual, and that when government decides, all the individuals come together, and therefore it's in other words, you set the thing again, and oh my God, it's a blank slate, and we can come to a new government. So we clean the other government that was unjust. We clean it out. But what happens if there's a connection to, in other words, so again, this is the problem. The state of nature and the government, in other words, the social contract of the creation of the social body and the government are not synonymous for him. He wants to say there's two different things. Okay, let's assume that. But what happens is there a tendency of a people towards one type of government over another type of government? And certain choices of behavior. Is there, in other words, this is something Locke doesn't answer, doesn't want to even consider. Because why? He's doing with the least individual, nice rational actor individuals, economic man. He's dealing with economic man, utility maximizing man. Ooh, utility maximizing man. His utility maximizing man is going to act in his interest. Okay. Let's look at, remember, this is where Thurston Veblen in his theory of leisure class is useful here. Just because you have concept of utility maximizing, well, what is utility? Maybe my utility is enjoying your pain. What? Everyone knows that. Wait a minute, utility maximizing. What is utility? He's assuming utility means profit. But what happens if I get more pleasure, or my utility is pleasure, and my pleasure is inflicting great pain on you? Or honor, this is no. Thurston Veblen does not talk about pain and plenty. He talks about honor seeking, right? He argues that no, honor seeking or status seeking is more important for us than utility seeking. But I would argue that, in other words, instead of utility in terms of economic activity, economic power, economic is utility, but social status is a form of utility also. It's a different type of utility, status seeking, but it's still a form of utility. So therefore, this is, in many ways, I would argue that there's the difference between, let's say, the classical liberal, the Manchesterian liberal of the economic utility model, and Veblen's idea of status seeking. This is not as, the logic is still the same. The utility maximizing conception is still there, But what is utility change? The meaning of what is the subject of utility changes. Okay, so okay, let's assume that this is the problem of Locke. The assumption he assumes that everyone's economic man, but what happens if it doesn't go from economic man? Let's and I in my example of the pain seeker, the harm seeker. What does this do to Locke's argument? It throws a whole monkey wrench in it, doesn't it? Oh, but that's unlikely. Is it? We know that the level of sociopaths is like psychopaths exist. The percentage of psychopaths exist in our nature. Now, there's not. We don't have a race of sociopaths. It's a propensity. It's a human propensity, right? It is a certain percentage of the. It is in a demographic in a standard deviation of any group. There's going to be a certain percentage of sociopaths, right? But what happens? There was, but then what happens? Every group is every group going to be the same amount? No, every group's not different. Every group is going to have different structures. Therefore, what about is every group just a random selection of people? Locke's understanding of society almost comes to me to be a kind of random luck, no, shakeback. But it's not. That is not work. This is not how real societies and things work. It's based on kin-based groupings, and that these people have certain things in common, certain certain habits, certain ways of life, certain customs, certain beliefs, certain things that shape them in common. They're therefore going to have similar values, similar structures of their beliefs are going to create their values and their choices. Certain and maybe even personality aspects, and that's going to lead to differentiation between different societies. And these different societies are going to behave differently, and therefore they're going to do things, and they're not going to see each other as the same. They're going to compete with each other. Okay, this is why I think this is. I think you need to be here. And they have the right. This is why his argument: they have a liberty to create their new government. But what happens if the new government they create is identical to their old and does the same thing? You see the problem with that? So I can't take away their property and their land because they have a right to do these things, and therefore, once I can't conquer. They have to be left alone because they don't. They even the conqueror, right? Did not oppose them in the posterity of those that did. The conqueror has even a just war has no had by his conquest has no dominion over them, and they're free from any subjugation from them. And if the government is dissolved, they are able to free to create new government. The conqueror, if it is true, usually by force he has over them and compels them with a sword at their breast to stoop to his conditions and submit to such a government that he pleases to afford them. But the inquiry is what right did he has to do this? If it be said they submit by his own consent, then this allows their own consent to be necessarily given to the conqueror's title to rule over them. Okay? They consented. By the way, Hobbes would say, yes, they had a choice: death, life, death, life. Social same damn social, the same damn logic you have in the social contract. Violent death, life. Violent death, life. Choose life. In other words, if you throw this out, you throw the social contract out. So Locke, by doing this, by suggesting that it's not really like this, you throw the social contract out. Now, remember, his understanding of the social contract is going to be no, Locke, Mr. Hobbes, you go too far, you go too much. No. In other words, Locke wants a lighter version of Hobbes, a more mild version, one more less arbitrary, more limited, more respecting of the. See, nature isn't completely arbitrary. In other words, without justice. In other words, He doesn't want to go to as far as Hobbes regarding nature. Nature's all war. No, 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 no. Nature's not completely war. Nature can be our guide to us in that sense. But the problem with that is once you do that, the system breaks down. You either accept Hobbes's little situation, or you undermine the very nature of the structure. In that sense, you have to. This great complicated argument becomes unworkable, in a sense. Locke does, right? No conquest for this. Therefore, what is he has a right to? In other words, submit to the government anyway. So that being said, so he submit to their own consent. Then this allows their own consent to be necessary. In other words, if that be said, they submit by their own consent, then this allows their own consent to be necessary to give the conqueror a title over to rule over them. It remains only to be considered whether promises exerted under force without right can be thought consent, and how far do they bind? To which I shall say they bind not at all, because whatsoever gets by gets another gets me by force, I still retain the right, and he is also obliged presently to restore it. That he forces my horse from me, ought presently to restore him, and I have a right to take a right to retake him, the horse. That is him, right? But the same reason that he forced a promise from me, ought presently to restore it, quit me of my obligation of it, or I may resume it myself, i.e., choose whether I will perform it. For the law of nature lays an obligation on me only by the rules she prescribes, cannot oblige me by the violation of her rules. Such is the extorting of anything from me by force. Like, but state of nature can't do this. Therefore, how do you? You're trying to escape the state of nature, or at least the state of war, which happens, right? The defects of nature you form society. That state of nature is imperfect. You can't achieve your needed security and safety. See, this is the difference between law. See, Hobbes argues that nature is insufficient. Because nature is insufficient, we need that. Therefore, justice is always really about the social. Locke wants to say, but then nature's just. He wants to escape nature, but not escape the state of nature's justice. This idea that, and therefore to kind of regulate and kind of constrain. He needs something to constrain the social contract, the state that is constructed. He's trying to find a mechanism to regulate the new social product, to limit it to what it can do. And therefore he does this by bringing in the state of nature, justice, which is found in nature, right? But Hobbes says, "Sorry, that's a folly. That's a folly, Mister Locke." Um, um, he goes, "I restore not choose to from a law of nature oblige me and only to the rules it prescribes, cannot oblige me to the violation of her rules, and by extorting anything from me by force. Nor does it at all alter the case to say, I gave my promise, no more than it excuses the force and passes the right. When I put my hand in my pocket and deliver my purse to a thief who demands it with the pistol to my breast." So again, this argument here, Hobbes would say, you just undid the state of nature. You undid the social contract. Sorry, because the fear of the war, you're trying to escape the war of all against all. You're trying to escape this arbitrary situation. You're trying to get a situation. You want to judge. You want rules to protect you. So, problem here, Mr. Locke. That is something that you would not. In other words, if it wasn't for this defects of nature, you wouldn't want to. You seem to not say you would want to stay in nature. Okay, but okay. 187. From all which follows that the government of the conqueror, imposed by force on the subdued, against whom he has no right to war, or who joined not in the war against him, where he had right, has no obligation upon them. So has no obligation to on these people who did not do that. So okay, 188. But let us suppose then all the men of that community, being all members of the same body politic, may be taken to have joined in an unjust war wherein they are subdued, so their lives are at the mercy of the conqueror. Okay, that's right. 189. I say this concerns not their children who are in minority, since a father hath not in his power over life or the liberty over the life or liberty of his child, nor act no act can of his can possibly forfeit it. So that the children, whatever may have happened to the father, are freemen, and the absolute power of the conqueror has reaches no farther than the persons of the men that were subdued him by him, and dies with them. And should he govern them as slaves, subject to his arbitrary power, he has no such right of dominion over their children. He can have no power over them, but by their own consent, whatever he may drive them to say or do, he has no lawful authority, while force and not choice compels them into submission. What about people in your own society? See, Locke says, well, everyone has a right to not decide to be. See, Locke's argument earlier, remember, you can decide if you don't want to be society, I can go leave over here. I ain't going to say, if I don't say I'm going to accept your citizenship, do I accept my citizenship and accept being a legitimate? I follow the rules, I obey the laws, accept all the rules, but I don't actively become a member. I don't want like this. I can go over here to that society. This idea of obligation of citizens. There's no obligation. Everyone's a free agent. Everyone's a free agent. They can choose how the way they go. Okay. This is the economic man individualist character of the Lockean model here. I can't compel them to submission like this. Every man is born with a double right. This is section 190. Every man is born with a double right. First, the right of freedom of his person, which no other man has a power over. But the free disposal of it lies in himself. But it doesn't lie in this himself. You can't harm yourself. You can do something. In other words, but the free disposal of it lies in. Secondly, a right before any. In other words, a right before any other man to inherit his father's goods. Inherit with his father's good. Brothers, in other words, brothers. In other words, you have a right to things. You have a right to inherit. What is your father's? But why would you have a right to inherit? Why? It's his. In other words, this paternity problem. Father's goods. Well, why his father's? Why not his mother's? Both parents, right? Paternal. Everything your parents done is now yours. Does this right exceed his life? So, in other words, this is the double standard, right? Everything, the father has no right to the property of the child, but the child has a right to get everything the father has. Why? his father. But why isn't this reversible? But it's not. So the future has an obligation on the past. Doesn't sound logical. Okay, let's stop. Let's get this done. By 191, by the first of these, a man is naturally free from the subjection of any government, though he be born in a place under his jurisdiction. But if he exclaims that lawful government of his country he is born in, he must also quit the rights that belong to him by the laws of it, and the possessions there descending to him from his ancestors, if it were a government made by their consent. So therefore, you leave, but you have to give up anything that you benefited from, that you got from that. But only if it was by their consent. If they didn't consent to it, you still have the right to it. They get rid of it. 192. By the second, the inhabitants of any country who are descended and derive a title to their estates from those who are subdued and had a government forced upon them against their free consent, have a right to the possessions of their ancestors, though they though they can though they consent not freely to the government, uh, whose hard conditions were forced uh, were by force imposed on the possessions of that country. For the first conqueror, never having had a title to the land of that country, the people who are descendants or or claim under those who were forced to submit to the yoke of a government by constraint have always a right to shake it off and free themselves from the usurpation or tyranny which had which the sword hath brought upon them, till their rulers has put under such a firm government as they willingly and of choice consent to. Who doubts but the Grecian Christians, descent from of the ancestors possessors of that country, may justly cast off the Turkish yoke, which they had so long groaned under, whether they had the opportunity to do it. In other words, he gives the example of the old the Christianized Greeks over the Turks, who's been ruled. Turkey conquered the Greeks, the Turks under the Ottomans, conquered the Greeks, and ruled them despotically. In other words, the Greeks want their independence. They have a right. They're not the same Greeks of before, but in other words, and this didn't have the opportunity. For no government can have a right to obedience from people who have not freely consented to it, which they can never be supposed to do, till either they are put in full state of liberty to choose their government and governors, or till they have such standing laws, which they have by themselves or their representatives given their free consent, and till and also till they are allowed their due property, which is also to be proprietors of what they had, that nobody can take away any part without their own consent, without which men under any government are not in the state of freemen, but are direct slaves under the force of war. So, in other words, free people mean, in other words, only free people. Okay, this is where the feminists get their ideas about. This is Dworkin's. This is Andrea Dworkin's concept. Well, they're not free and equal. If they're not really truly equal, if there's inequality among men and women, there cannot be consent. They're not totally free and totally independent. That means, in totally free and not submitted and not bound. and that means they have their access to their property, and it's their property. Then and they've consented to do so, knowing that you can't take their property. This is silly. This is a lot. This is lot. This world doesn't exist. And if it did exist, you follow these rules, it won't exist long because it doesn't make it just doesn't because it does lead to war, constant disorder. Because what happens if I change my mind? People change their mind. I have no obligation. The second I change my mind, I can change out of it. No, I don't want this anymore. Sorry. I don't like it. I don't want it. I consented. Yes, I consented. But now I don't consent. But I gave my consent. So, but I was really forced into it. And I was naive and I wasn't informed of my knowledge. And I felt pressure. I did it under pressure. In other words, this is the problem of the Locke's condition makes this becomes absurd unless you have this kind of unless you accept the innocent and the simplicity of his world, then it's possible, but then it's still disorderly. It leads us to I'm going to free myself from this obligation. I'm going to give up my property and I'm going to go over here at this place. No. And that therefore, what about these people who are there? In other words, and people who are done by force and like this, constant. It's always a state of war. Then society, because it's always going to be some coercion in it, is always in a state of war. No, there's always going to be some level of involuntary and non-consented authority over you. That means it's unjust, and therefore everything's a state of war. No consent, arbitrary, and therefore arbitrary state of war. Problem here. 193. But granting that the conquest of a just war has a right to the estates as well as power over the persons of the conquered, which it is plain he had not, nothing of absolute power will follow from hence. In the continuance of the government, because the descendants of those being all freedmen, if he grants them estates and possessions to inhabit his country, without which it would be worth nothing, whatsoever he grants them, they have, as far as it was granted, property, the nature whereof, that without a man's own consent, it cannot be taken from him. So, okay. Locke just wants to show every possibility that he wants to argue that conquest never brings legitimacy. Only consent does. He's going to torture this to no end to make this clear. But the problem with this is that this doesn't make this creates more problems ultimately than it does. 194. Their persons are freed by a native right, and their properties, be they more or less, are their own, and at their own dispose, and not of his, or else it is not property. Right? Property means mine. If I can't control or dispose, it's not my property. It's not property then. So again, this is by definition, right? He defined it, and therefore this is reality. But that's not. Supposing the conqueror gives to one man 1,000 acres to him and his heirs forever, and another he lets have 1,000 acres for life, under the rent of £50 or £500 per annum. Has not the one of these a right to 1,000 acres forever, and the other during his life paying the said rent? And hath not the tenant of life a property in all that he gets over and above the rent by his labor and industry said during that term, supposing it be double? The rent Can anyone say the king or conqueror, after his grant, may by the power of conquer take all away and part the land or part of the land from the heirs of one or from the other during his life, he paying the rent, or can he take away from either the goods or money they have gotten upon said land at his pleasure? In other words, again, this is the problem, is because the answer is you'll say no, but the reason why this is saying no is because the English common law says this the case. At one, and this is emerges out of contract and out of certain structures, not of a general principle. Okay, in other words, that, and actually, English common law is unique to England. It's not. It's not. I'm sorry, and it was brought over as colonies. It's not something that is. It did not develop uniformly everywhere in the world. Trust me. The Roman law, the common English common law, is unique from England and its descendants and those who followed. No other place within Europe and the European or the world that the common law emerged in a similar way. And the common law is a unique construct with certain social structures. It emerged in a particular place, and it's not arising elsewhere. But it has a significant advantages that the other laws don't. Okay, again, this is it. This is the problem. Locke depends upon something. In other words, he bases norms out of something that is a unique thing, and assumes it to be everywhere the case. See the problem with that? That's the Lockean problem in that sense. In other words, he takes something that is a unique historical consequence and then assumes it's the norm and then creates logical principles for it. This is what Locke does here. In other words, he takes something, an example of something, and then treats it as the norm and treats it as the what should happen by nature. He takes the exception and normalizes it. I'm not saying the exception is not good. In fact, we can say it's beneficial, but it's not. It happens out of a certain set of occurrences, certain set of choices made by particular people. It is not simply the outcome of random acts. It is not simply just you took. You had a. In other words, this is not a situation where it's like a set of dice, and that therefore, under certain limited conditions of six options, like a six-sided. If I have six-sided dice, right, occasionally I'm going to get six sixes. Right. That's not. This doesn't know how it works. It's not. It's not every time you do it. There's going to be the possibility of this coming up. It's even higher. It's not that the dice. Imagine a situation where the dice numbers are not. The number of dice will vary, and it's not going to be six-sided dice. Some dices will be three-sided, two-sided, three-sided, four-sided. Everything is going to be different in that weird, and that therefore there's no in other words, that something can emerge that is unique, but compared to other ones, it's a more advantage, and other people copy it. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that the system generates it. That's the problem of this little argument. And whereas the English law, you can't take it as you. In other words, this is again a product of specific common law principles. Now, some of them are from Roman law. Some of them are the concepts of Roman law, limitations of this. But again, this is what I think there's a problem here in this. I give you forever, and okay. In other words, if he can with free voluntary, okay. If he can then at all free and voluntary contract cease. If he can, then all voluntary. In other words, he can take it as his pleasure. Then all voluntary contracts cease and are void in the world. So it's either or. Either you do it. In other words, what happens in the world where it's not either or? It's both. There's going to be a range. There's going to be voluntary contracts, but there's also going to be some reality of involuntary reality. It's for Locke. It's either voluntary or involuntary, and it's either or. Right? There's no separating piece. If he can, then all voluntary contracts cease and are void in the world. There needs nothing to dissolve them at any time, but power enough. And all the grants and promises of men in power are but mockery and collusion. For there can be for can there be anything more ridiculous than to say, I give you and yours this forever, and that in the surest and most solemn way of conveyance can be devised, and yet it is to be understood that I have right, if I please, to take it away from you again tomorrow. Saying this doesn't make sense. Saying it's inconsistent. But it's not this way. This isn't how it never works. The king took it away from you because he felt you broke your promise. You committed treason. You did something. You did something. You said something or did something, and you forfeited your right. Or you failed to deliver. He had an expectation that you were going to do something. I gave you this with the expectation that you were going to do certain things. You failed to do them. Sometimes this was explicit, sometimes these conditions were implicit. It wasn't really, in other words, but then what happens is people mistake the action of the king taking it back as being arbitrary. No, it wasn't arbitrary. It was, in other words, this is what Henry often would take away positions of people in responsibility. It's arbitrary. Some people say, oh, this is the arbitrary prince. But he gave them that position and they were expected to deliver. That when they failed to deliver, therefore they failed. In other words, they breached the agreement and therefore they were removed. Okay, see the problem with this? There was consent and there was. In other words, Toop can play this kind of idea that no, actually, mister, you did consent. And yes, there is consent there is consent of the stronger. I can choose, if I choose that, there is this obligation here. But if once you, in other words, this is a silly argument. In other words, we can make one more, we're forced to either accept Locke's argument or make an equally sillier counter argument to him because we're playing his game. And this is what Locke wants. Locke has devised a trick here that you have to agree to him because if you follow once you engage with the kind of rational argument that he's doing, you're forced to either accept it or not accept it, or to engage in an even sillier argument in order or take it more extreme than he does, in order or go into an additional dimension that exists within this logic of what he does. Now, this is in many ways what happens in the political thought in that sense. In many ways, isn't this what Locke's doing to Hobbes? Isn't then what Rousseau does the same thing? Rousseau responds as to Locke and Hobbes with a more extreme version. This is the same thing at Kant and Hegel, right? All of the modern thought, political thought, almost is kind of a kind of starting with the premise of Hobbes and then radicalizing it and radicalizing it and radicalizing it, while rejecting aspects of it and radicalizing the other aspects of it. Okay, we've been. This is long enough. Let's continue. 195. I will not dispute now whether princes are exempt from the laws of their country. But this I am sure they owe subjugation to the laws of God and nature. I'm not going to do one, but then I'm going to argue that they must obey the laws of God and nature. Okay, It's relying on divine, but nature too. Nobody, no power can exempt them from the obligations of that eternal law. Those who are so great and so strong, in the case of the promises, that omnipotency itself can be tied by them. Grants, promises, and oaths are bound that holds the Almighty. Whatever some flatterer says to princes of the world, who are all together, with all their people joined to them, are in comparison of the great God, but that of a drop in the bucket, or the dust on the balance, inconsiderable, nothing. Again, he's relying on this. He's relying on the Christian readers' prejudices. He's playing to their prejudices. See, Locke's a Christian. See, he's using this, but is he? Is he just using this as kind of a mic to get you to force to buy you? He's appealing to the Christians' vanity and their beliefs, and therefore he's giving it to them in sugar doses that they're willingly accept it. In other words, is he not giving them a kind of false pill? He's coating his thing so sickly with Christianity and Judeo-Christian argument and things that the Christian will say, of course. You swallow the pill. Is it all this designed to kind of sell something? To sell this Hobbesian, Lockean rationalism? And accept it? Once you accept it, you can't escape from it. And God is everything. Okay, the problem with nature. Let's look at the nature thing. Well, all kings are above nature, but we know that in the state of nature, people will. Hobbes is clear about it, not Locke's clear about this also. Nature is not powerful enough. The state of nature is, and the laws of nature are not powerful enough to punish the violator. In nature, there is no judge and there's no execution. It's only you, every individual is the judge and executor on their own. And therefore it's self-help. Every man for himself and self-help. And this is an imperfect situation. Hobbes is more clear on this. Hobbes says it's not only imperfect, it's a disaster. It's so bad that everyone wants to flee from it. Hobbes says it's not initially bad. It gets bad, yeah, but not intentionally, and it gets bad because the world gets smaller and people competing for competition. As long as the world is big, people can run away and fine, but sooner or later everything gets together and we need to escape it. Okay, and it's, even though yes, it's nature is good and its norms, but it's imperfect, and we want to, and actually by doing this, we're better off, right? He accepts the Hobbesian law, the argument that we're better off in this, and that the artificial structure makes us better, and we're able to live much better than we were in nature. That's his whole argument about labor, right, and the production of things. That man's construct of labor produces more than nature provides itself. So if that's true, then why is nature a standard? It's the problem here? Okay. So God, he relies on God and the perception of God to kind of makes the argument for his case. Okay. 196. But he believes these things. Really? Does he believe these things? Or is he relying that you believe it so you don't question his argument? Okay. 196. The short of the case in Conquest is this. The logic. The conqueror, if he has just cause, has a despotic right over the persons. In other words, he has just cause. He has a despotic right over the persons of all that actually aided and concurred in the war against him, and a right to make up his damages and cost out all their labor and estates, so that so he injures not the right of any other. So he can only, in other words, no, he can't harm the. He can take their money and things to the degree they're not harming anyone else who didn't wage war on them. Over the rest of the people, if they were any that consented not to the war, or over the children and captives themselves, of the captives themselves, or their possessions of either, he has no power. So he can have, by virtue of the conquest, no lawful title over to dominion over them, to deprive it of his deprive it of his posterity. But is an aggressor if he attempts upon their properties and put himself in a state of war against them, and has no better a right of principality, he or any of their successors, that Hinger or Hubba, the Danes, as here in England, or Spartacus, that had he conquered Italy, would have had, which is to have their yoke cast off as soon as God shall give them those under their subjection or an opportunity to do it. In other words, all these Hager, Hubba, the Danes here in England, and Spartacus in Italy, the slaves, they rebel and they win. They get their freedom. God, as soon as God gives them their subjection, courage, and the opportunity to do it. Thus, notwithstanding whether the title of kings of Assyria or head over Judah by the sword, God assisted Hezekiah to throw off the dominion of that conquering empire. And the Lord was with Hezekiah as he prospered. In the Bible, this is Second Kings. Wherefore, if he went forth and he rebelled against the king of Assyria and served him not. Second Kings, right? This is that verb. Um, Whence it is plain the striking off of a power, which force and not right has set over one, though it had the name of rebellion, yet is no offense before God, but is that which he allows in consequences, even through even promises and covenants, when obtained by force, has intervened. For it is very profitable to anyone that reads the story of Azad and Hezekiah attentively, that the Assyrians subdued Hazad and disposed him, and made Hezekiah king of his father's lifetime, and that Hezekiah, by agreement, had done him homage and paid him tribute all this time. So, in other words, he's going to the Bible. He's going to use the Bible as the example. He gives the Bible, the Old Testament, the Second Kings, as that this is that. And what happened was then the people who rebelled against an unjust conqueror imposed peace, imposed rule, despotic rule, and then even then, what happens? Well, the people were at the right moment they will rebel and assert their freedom, they rebel and defeat the conqueror, or throw off the conqueror, right, and establish their autonomy back then. Okay, this is the whole point of the conquest. Well, this is where we're going to end. If you have any comments, please give it. It's been a long one. It's just going to be a long one. If you have any comments, I will see them. I'll say them. Otherwise, if you liked it, like it. Didn't like it, say why. Subscribe. Please have friends subscribe. Forward it. Share this, please. You think it's worthwhile sharing with people. And if you want to follow me on social media, you can follow it below. If you like what I'm doing, and you can a Patreon or subscribe star. I'm not going to push it, but it would help. Otherwise, take care and have a good day. Whew, this was a long one. Take care. Bye bye.